There we go. All right, so yeah, this is a position paper where we're essentially proposing a new technique for hardening the execution of neural networks. And the bottom line up front basically is we're going to take each layer of a DNN and split it over multiple nodes in a network, right? So if you're like a cloud infrastructure provider, or if you have access to like a cluster of different machines, you could leverage that to create or obfuscate the execution of a DNN, right? So we're going to take one layer and we're going to split a DNN by layer, and then each layer goes onto a different node in a network of different physical hosts. And this will demonstrate, we have some initial network simulation results that demonstrate this increases essentially the amount of information that an attacker would have to have access to in order to fully compromise or steal that deep neural network. And as I'll discuss in the slides coming up here, we're going to leverage a few insights from genetic improvement. We can represent this challenge, like which layer goes on which host, as a genetic improvement problem that can further help us improve this hardening. And then finally, we have a prototype that we're releasing. It's called Jigsaw, so that's the overall name of the technique. So that's how I'll refer to it throughout the presentation here. So just to give you a bit of background, if you're not familiar necessarily with this area, a lot of times we have neural networks that are proprietary, right, or just not something that we want to share. Maybe it's because OpenAI is not so open, but there are other applications like the medical space, right? If I have a neural network that's trained on medical images, like chest X-rays to predict the presence of like a certain type of tumor, for instance, that model will be trained on sensitive patient data that we don't want to have compromised by an adversary, whether the adversary steals the model or if they affect what the model does or computes as output. We wouldn't want that to happen. And indeed, if an adversary, for instance, has access to the weights of the model, there's already techniques that exist that allow you to recover portions of the training data. So there are applications, like this where it's just not good. From a security standpoint, we don't want an adversary to compromise or have access to that model. There are a few different existing techniques relating to training data and like adversarial perturbations and robust training of models that can partially address this problem. But there is a specific demands, and what we're specifically addressing are a certain type of model stealing attack, where if an adversary has access to, say, like particular memory addresses where on the host where the model is actually executing, they could recover portions of the model, which would be stored as a data structure in memory, thereby stealing part of the model, right? So if an adversary has access to enough of the system memory where that model is executing, they could potentially recover or steal a model executing on that host, right? And indeed, this table on the slide here on the right is showing, this is from essentially a survey of industrial practitioners, what are the most common or I guess concerning types of attacks underpinning or threatening deep neural networks, and model stealing is up there, right? The ability for an adversary to come in and steal either model weights or the neural architecture of a deep neural network. Right, so this model extraction problem, just to give you a little bit more background on that, if I have a private model, f of x, this is model stealing is when an adversary comes in and recovers f of x, right? So f of x is supposed to be private, and there's a whole suite of techniques that allow an adversary to recover f of x. They could use essentially like black box testing. If I just have a million inputs that I give to this model, and I just write down all of the outputs, in theory, I could copy f of x if I have enough data. But there are more subtle techniques, as I was hinting earlier. If an adversary has access to the host where that model is executing, they could potentially, like through side channel techniques, extract model weights or model architecture to recover or steal that model, right? And again, there's a host of techniques listed here that relate to that. Things like Spectre, cache side channel vulnerabilities. You could recover portions of the model weights, things like Rowhammer, where you could affect what the model is producing, and also GPU timing information, since GPUs are common accelerators for computing machine learning outputs. Right? There's a Now, there are a number of techniques in this space for preventing this type of model stealing attack, and they all cover different properties, right? So this Venn diagram is showing kind of a balance between what we're calling memory scalable, like can the technique that we employ to defend this model scale up with model size? Like, is it good enough for a big model? The green circle on the right there, no hardware modification. We want a technique that does not require you to buy a new GPU or a new computer. It wouldn't be cost effective. We'd like a technique that we could implement in software without having to either change the physical GPU circuitry to implement the defense. Then finally, we want things that are resistant to side channels, right? As I was hinting earlier, there's things like Spectre and this new renaissance of cache side channel vulnerabilities that threaten, among other things, the weights and model architecture that would be stored potentially in memory to allow an adversary to steal or extract a model executed in there, right? And like I was saying, all of these existing prior works each cover one of these properties, but there's no unicorn in the middle that covers all of them. And that's what we're hoping to achieve with Jigsaw. Again, this is the technique that we're proposing. So how does it actually work? Just to give you some intuition here, there's a little bit more detail in the paper. And like I said, there's a prototype implementation that we have. We have a neural network that we're going to take as inputs, right, that has, and specifically, it's a feed-forward network. We haven't really touched things like recurrent neural networks. That's a different can of worms. But we have an inputs neural network. And what we'll do is we're going to split it by layer. Right? Each layer then gets sent to a different host to execute. It could be a different physical host. It could be a virtual machine if you are running a bunch of VMs on a single host. And we've even, like in an early prototype of this technique, we also had it just running as like separate instances of like programs on the same host. There's a variety of ways to do this, but the bottom line is you take each layer and you're going to put it on a different host. Then we'll have a master node that takes the first layer and sort of schedules, well, which layer is going to be assigned to which host. And in doing so, the first layer computes, the output tensor gets fed to the next host, where it executes the next layer. It sends that output tensor to the next host to execute the next tensor, so on and so forth, until you finally have the final output tensor and the final machine learning, or the final result of the machine learning activity that you're doing. Now, if you're kind of looking closely here, there's a whole large number of permutations of which layer goes on which host, right? So depending on how many hosts you have available, again, if you're like a cloud infrastructure provider with lots of different customers, maybe you have a whole lot of different GPU machines that you could potentially use. And you could say, well, for this inference, I'm going to put the first layer on this host, the second layer on this host, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the next inference, I'm going to completely scramble it, right? And so we can gain this sort of moving target defense where we say, well, if an adversary wanted to compromise the entirety of this model, they'd need to have access to a lot more than they would currently. They'd need to compromise all of the hosts that are involved, and they'd need to compromise the order in which the hosts are executing each layer. In addition to the weights and the architecture that make up the layer itself, right? So we're kind of increasing the amount of information the adversary would have to know in order to correctly or completely recover the model, right? And the way that we can represent this, again, I was hinting at this earlier, is as essentially a genome. We can have a big bit vector where each column represents a specific layer of the original model, and then each row indicates a specific host. And the way that you would read this big matrix is, for one of these matrices, it's indicating, will I allow a given layer to execute on a given host, right? So I can make up this big, large matrix of ones and zeros to kind of indicate that. And then when I go to run inference on the model, I would consult the schedule first and then say, okay, well, this time I'm going to say that layer X goes on host Y and kind of carry out the model execution that way. And so because we can represent this organization of layers and hosts as a big vector of ones and zeros, is quite amenable to some of the traditional mutation operators that make this suitable for a genetic improvement algorithm. And the key things here, right, this is what ends up emerging here is a multi-objective optimization problem, because we have to balance how much more diverse is the model and its surface of execution. So like, how much more diverse is the set of hosts and organization of layers compared to the original model? So that's one thing that we want to maximize. And then on the other hand, we also want to minimize latency and essentially increases in latency due to the presence of the network, right? So if we're going to split up this model and put each layer on its own separate host, well, there's a lot of network communication that's introduced now as a result of this splitting. And we want to minimize that in part by paying attention to potentially, how big is the tensor between two layers, right? So if it's a bigger tensor, well, maybe that's going to be even more network communication to get from one layer to the next. And things like that, right? The organization of the hosts, depending on how the network is set up and so forth. There's a number of different impacts that, or a number of ways that impacts overall network latency, right? So we're going to try and optimize for both of these two things: diversity of the model, like how much more secure is it by introducing this technique compared to how much slower is the model going to execute by splitting the model up in this way. And so we're going to essentially apply genetic improvement over this matrix of ones and zeros to come up with a schedule of layer host pairs that fits this multi-objective optimization. So again, the original schedule is this matrix. Again, each column corresponds to a layer, and then each row corresponds to a host in the network that you have. And then you can stretch this out into a big vector, and then standard mutation operators apply. Maybe I'll have some crossover. Maybe I'll just randomly change a few points, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll have a tournament selection at the end. Currently, it's done in simulation, where we say, okay, given this schedule, let me run inference on a few samples to see how much additional latency is introduced. And we also measure, as I'll explain in a moment, how much bigger is the surface of information required for the attacker to fully compromise the model. So it's a tournament selection process that ends up coming up with this outputs vector of ones and zeros that is, we hope, an optimal schedule of layers and hosts in the network. So as I said, we have some initial results based on simulation. So we have simulated network latency and so forth with a few different, again, feed-forward neural networks. There's two plots that I want to show. So on the bottom left, this three-dimensional plot is showing on the horizontal axis here iterations, so the number of generations in the genetic improvement algorithm that we allowed it to run. And then on the axis going into the screen is the number of minion pools. So how many minion hosts, how many hosts do you have in the network over which you can allocate execution of each layer in the neural network? And then this y-axis going up and down is the number of unique page frame numbers occupied during execution of the model in the entire network. So page frame numbers we're using it as a quick proxy for how much information would the attacker have to compromise to fully extract the model. As the model executes, if you're splitting execution over multiple hosts in a network, the number of unique pages that is occupied by the model during its execution, that's another place that in memory that the adversary would have to have access to in order to fully extract all of the weights and portions of the neural architecture, right? So it is, again, we're using it as a proxy for, like increase in diversity or increase in security here. The more page frame numbers that we see, the more stuff the adversary would have to have access to. And what we can see is, for a fixed number of minions, so like at 5 here, as we move from left to right, there's a linear increase in the number of unique page frame numbers found. What this means is that the genetic improvement algorithm is indeed finding more optimal solutions with respect to this notion of diversity in unique page frame numbers, right? So that's some initial promise that this technique, that genetic improvement does indeed improve the diversity of or the amount of information required by an adversary to compromise the model. Now on the right here is a latency distribution chart. It's showing on the x-axis here is the number of minions. Again, that's the number of hosts that you would have in the network available to carry out this type of split machine learning execution. And as expected, right, if you add more minions to the network, that means that there's more opportunities for network communication, which means that you're inherently going to increase how much latency is required to fully execute the model. Right now, luckily, right, if you look at all the way at the right, it's not like a single perfect increase in latency. It's more of a distribution, right? The more minion nodes that you introduce, the bigger a spread you have on the final latency. It's not just a strict increase in latency because it is possible, for instance, that two layers execute on the same host, and that minimizes network latency, or the way that the genetic improvement would find a potential schedule could make it so that two layers are on different hosts that share a very small tensor requiring a very little amount of network execution. So it's not necessarily a strict increase, you just get a bigger spread on how much latency is required to fully execute the model. So where does that leave us? Again, this is a position paper, so it's very initial work currently, but what we're trying to do is harden the execution, the infrastructure underpinning the execution of deep neural networks to prevent model extraction attacks, right? We don't want an adversary to steal or affect the model weights or the model architecture. While there are a number of techniques that exist to do this activity, none of them are perfect or provide a balance between scalability, minimizing changes to hardware, and resistance against side channel attacks. So our approach, Jigsaw, is addressing this problem by splitting up execution of a neural network by layer to deploy each layer on a unique, separate host in a network. And we have some initial results that show genetic improvement can help us balance the increase in the amount of information that the attacker would require against the introduction of additional latency by due to network communication. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Do you have any question to Kevin?
Hi, I was wondering if you would think Jigsaw is applied in practice, how large do you envision the search space to be in terms of layers and nodes?
It's a great question. So how big would the search space be? And indeed, one of the reasons that we picked diversification by layer was indeed part of this issue. We were originally envisioning that the atomic unit of distribution would actually be an individual node, and you'd somehow sort of string together different hosts all computing the same layer. But that ended up being kind of impractical. Well, first of all, because of the network latency, but also just because the increase in search space that results in just too much to search through in a viable amount of time, especially as you're increasing the number of hosts that are available. The evaluation that we show only went up to 5 hosts. In practice, what we're thinking is, if we're deploying, if this were given to a cloud infrastructure provider that might have hundreds of customers, they're going to have a much larger number of potential minions, and that would additionally increase the search space. So I think it's a difficult question because you'd have to consider the specific model that you would want to apply this to. It may not be feasible to say, well, for this gigantic, huge model with billions of parameters, maybe it doesn't make as much sense to split it by layer, but maybe instead you sort of chunk it into blocks of execution to kind of keep it within a reasonable search space.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi. Is that bit matrix, is that stored on every node?
Is the bit matrix stored on every node? Yeah, for the prototype, yes, but in practice, that would only be given to the master node, and then the next minion node would only know the next layer that it would, or the next host that it would send its results to.
Okay. So if an attacker got a hold of that matrix, would you be back in the same situation you were in at the beginning? Would they have all the information they'd need?
It would certainly make their job easier, but not quite. And the reason is because this matrix represents not a specific schedule, but a set of possible schedules to use, right? So if we go back to I'll just show this example here. So this first matrix up here, it's saying, well, the first host is capable of executing all 4 of these layers. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to. You could come up with a schedule where the same layer executes or could execute on multiple different hosts. And so even if they stole the matrix, they wouldn't necessarily know the specific schedule picked for that inference. One of the other aspects of diversity here is every time you run inference, based on this matrix, you pick like, okay, the matrix says if I want to, optimize diversity and minimize latency, execute layer 1 on host 3. And on the next inference run, maybe it's execute layer 1 on host 5. So even if they stole it, they wouldn't necessarily know the specific schedule.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, I don't know much about DNNs. Are some layers more critical than others? Is the question.
For some applications, sometimes you'll want to have like the specific output of a layer. So it is possible that some of the layers are more critical than others. I think that's reasonable.
Because that's what I was wondering if you account for that, as in I can imagine if you just had 2 nodes, say, and we just said, okay, we run the first half of the layers on node 1 and the second half on node 2, versus interleaving where I run layer 1 on node 1, layer 2 on node 2, layer 1 on node 3, like a perfect split versus interleaving. Is there an advantage there to one strategy over the other? That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Indeed, we did not account for that, but I think that is fair, and that could be one of the other another objective to account for in the genetic search would be, well, how much relative importance is there for this layer? Again, that might be a model specific question. So it might be part of the an inputs that you would convey to something like Jigsaw. But yeah, that's reasonable. We're not accounting for it. We're treating all layers as equal, but in practice, that's might be something to account for. Like, oh, well, because this layer is not as important, I don't really care where it executes. Let me just, chunk it with another layer, for example.
Okay. And how much data goes between layers? Like if I was processing an image, does it have to send the whole image between each layer, or does it kind of narrow down the amount that goes?
So not the whole image. Again, it depends on the specific model architecture. It's basically a vector of floating point numbers that represents the activations from the previous layer. And so this big list of floating point numbers, it could range in size, honestly up to even a couple of megabytes for a really big model. And so there is quite a bit of network latency introduced as a result of the size of the communication.
Okay.
So for this session, so let's thank the speakers again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. And we are going to take a group photo right now, so please come to the front. Yeah.